I got it.
Okay. Okay, we're ready. You want me to do it? You want to do it?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. If you don't mind shutting the back door, it sounds a little loud still out there from the break. Thank you. Welcome to NetMod in Prague. I'm Lou Berger. This is Kent Watson. We're chairs, obviously, and we have Michael Wang, who's helping us out. There he is. Who's been helping us out as secretary. As usual, this will be shown again. As usual, on our slide, we show where you can find the different information. On the tools page, and that's the easy way to get to it, you'll find that there's a Jabber. There's a Etherpad link, and if you could join the Etherpad and help us with collective note-taking, we'd like to do that. Before we get into the session, we have the usual note well, but it's actually changed slightly. This was just updated based on RFC 8179 being published. Some folks may have noticed the blog entry talking about the changes. It's a new updated IPR policy for the IETF. It clarifies some things. From my reading of it, the most significant thing it does is clarifies what a contribution is and isn't. Basically, if you say anything in a meeting or in any forum, or even give any indication of your opinion, that's a contribution. The other thing it does is it points to an RFC, the number of which I'm forgetting, which talks about if you don't follow the IPR process, what are the steps a working group can do based on that. And that really goes to late disclosures. This is a pretty fresh change. It was just published in May. May not have noticed it before. You might want to take a look. As usual, we have Meet Echo, we have audio, and we do have some participants who are remote this time. Blue sheets are going around. Please sign them. And again, here's another way to get to the Etherpad. This is the longer form. If you get to the tools page and click under minutes, that's sort of the easiest way to get there. Our agenda is posted. We don't have any changes right now. We did have some requested changes, but we're going to just stick with it. We have a couple of sessions.
So at a high level, the agenda is meant to be, rather than going through all the working group documents first on the first session and then the non-chartered working group documents in the second session, we're breaking it up. So this session is primarily NMDA focus with some other documents sprinkled in. They may or may not be working group documents. And then likewise, the next session will be primarily focused on schema mount with some other documents sprinkled into it. And this particular agenda has been ordered with the ACL draft being presented first, so that the Q&A for the NMDA would be at the end. Gives us flexible timing. So if we're running out of short on time, it will be less than 20 minutes, but if we have more time, it'll be more.
Okay, from what's changed, I feel like this is really loud. What's changed since the last meeting? So we have one document that is sitting with the IESG, although our AD looks confused by that. Maybe not. So we have one document sitting with the IESG that's working through the process. We have 6087 BIS, which is the guidelines document that's been returned from the IESG primarily because of the update to NMDA guidelines, that document that's come out. The intent is, and we're going to hear more about this, the intent is to take the guidelines and produce a distilled recommendation that ends up replacing the current section in 6087 BIS. And once that replacement is agreed to by the working group, we'll resubmit 6087 BIS. We have a couple of documents that are in last call. Be good to take a look at those. The last call was extended because it's overlapping with this week. One of them, the one in green, is on the agenda. The second one is not. But please do take a look and send comments. I know our bracket cut out of alignment. We have a bunch of other updated working group documents that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of sessions. We already talked about 6087 BIS. I think we talked about all of these except for entity. So this document has been sitting out there for a while. The authors thought the technical content, the hard part, was complete, but that it might be impacted by NMDA, and in fact it has been. And the authors in GitHub have a partial update already completed, but it sounds like there's some work still left. Is there any of the co-authors in the room? Martin, who I think currently has the pen, is not. Andy is a co-author, but I think he's ducking. Andy, do you want to say anything about this? Aren't you a co-author in Entity? It's all right. You don't. If you don't want to say anything, that's okay.
No, I think the current status is that it was checked by a couple people that it had the new objects that they wanted, and I think now we have to look at what needs to be done to meet the new NM guidelines.
Yeah, and my understanding from Martin
already
was
started editing and already pushed some edits, so it's probably close to being ready.
Okay, it'd be great if we could see an update in short order so we can go to last call, because I think all the issues had pretty much been resolved at this point, other than the NMDA refactor.
And as you know, 687 BIS is
we talked about that already.
Still waiting guidelines about the new.
So Tim Karianowski, could I just get a clarification real
Sure,
quick
please.
on that? So it looks like then Entity will probably be the first draft that will see the data store guidelines, if you will, included in?
Are you talking about first to publication request or first published?
I guess it will probably be the first published then, right? Or is it going to be SysMon?
So there's been a whole bunch of internet drafts that have already been refactored to be conform with NMDA.
In other working groups.
So that work is like running ahead.
Okay.
So I think we have good examples if you're looking just for an example, and ones that are far more complex than this one. This is actually a pretty simple model. In terms of what we submit into the to the ISG for publication, I certainly hope that this is out very soon. So yeah, it would be the first one submitted by this working group.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Benoit Claes. So actually, it might be good to send liaison statement to different SDOs doing like young models to explain our NMDA, right?
That's actually an excellent idea. The one question I have a little bit maybe for you is do we wait till we have agreement on the recommendation text from the working group, which we don't have yet, or do we go just based on the AD recommendation that's been distributed? And maybe some other folks who work in other SDOs might have a view on this. I know we have some folks from BBF, some folks who work in IEEE, who I know can't make a IEEE statement, but they still work there. So
I think we could do both, right? For example, we had an IEEE IESG meeting this week, and I forgot to mention that. We could have an informal email because we have the contact, and then whenever we get text ready, then we mention that. So basically, it's like, okay, warning, it's coming.
That's a good idea. So one thing I failed to do is to go onto Etherpad and make sure we actually have people taking notes in Etherpad. Can we have just people raise hands if you're in on Etherpad taking notes?
That's not good.
All right, we need some people to jump in on Etherpad, please, and take notes. I am watching Jabber, though.
Sorry, I think Tim wants me to say something. William Lupton.
Can you start by saying your name?
Yeah, William Lupton, representing the Broadband Forum. So yeah, absolutely. We'd welcome a liaison telling us about NMDA, but equally, of course, we're aware of it already, and it's interesting that that maybe it'll be applied to entity very soon, because actually, that is one of the drafts that we're directly referencing.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see we're up to 8 in Etherpad. Thank you for joining. Please feel free to join in and type.
And if you could put your sign your name on the Etherpad in the upper right-hand corner, just so we know which name is which color.
But it's not a requirement.
Not a requirement. That's nice.
So with the last comment, I think that was a setup for the first bullet on this slide. Thank you. We've had one incoming liaison. It came in just recently, and basically it's letting us know that this other organization, the Broadband Forum, is interested in reusing the work we're producing in the IETF, and it called out entity, as we just heard. It also called out the alarm module. The alarm module, as has been discussed a couple of times at the IETF, privately, it's on list. That one has gone over to CCAMP, and we expect that work to be done there. If you have any, this one is not asking for a specific response, but if you have something you'd like to discuss based on the liaison, please just send it to the list. With that, we're going to wrap up with milestones. I'd like to highlight that, one, we have a few things are done. We have a few things that are a little late, but we're close. And the entity, we really need to figure out how to wrap up. And so I'm happy to hear that the authors are working that. We might soon see an update. And with that, we're going to move to the next slot, which is
the first presentation, ACL.
Okay, so Mahesh and I worked on the enhancements from draft 10 to draft 11. So these, so these include basically support of combinations of ACLs of different address families and types, and I'll also state the reason why this was done. There's also been inclusion of more match and action parameters, and this was taken from after we got input from Netflix. And there were also a lot of open issues that we found based on the review of various native models in. So these were opened up as issues, and we've documented it, and we've taken AIs to implement this. Okay, so why did we include support for ACL address families? So in the current model, in draft number 10, if you see, ACL type is not strictly checked. So in an ACL, you can have ACEs of V4, V6, and L2. So this doesn't work for vendors who want to, who can only support ACLs of a single address family type. Now, this leaves, if we have a model like this, this means that a vendor has to do strict type checking. And for most vendors, this is not acceptable. So what we did was to create, so basically the model becomes very error prone, and we needed a way to fix that. So what we did is that we took, we focused on L2, L3, and L4, and we made different combinations of these types, like different ACL types. So when you have the exchange message, you can specify which type the ACL conforms to, and you'll only see part of the Yang model that conform to that ACL type. So there's no room for error anymore. So, okay. Okay. So what we did here was that we created, so what I have on the right-hand side are the identity, feature, and container statements for a particular ACL type. And this is extended to all different ACL types that we support now. The benefits of this enhancement are that you have very strict type checking. So for example, if you support only v4 ACL, you will only see the header fields and IPv4 header fields that pertain to v4 ACL. There's no way you can now configure a v6 ACE within a v4 ACL or an L2 ACE. So this also makes the model easy to extend, because in case you want to extend it to have ACLs, I don't know, like an L7 ACL, all you need to do is write the identity, feature, and container statement, and that extends your model right away. And you don't have to make changes to the main body of the model like you would have had to do earlier. So these are the identity, and of these we have 8 new types. So since we focused on L2 and L3, you have a v4 ACL, v6, the Ethernet ACL. Then you have a mixed v4 ACLs. I'm sorry, you have the mixed L2 and v4 ACL. You have mixed L2 and v6. And then you have mixed L2, v4, and v6. And then you have something, so we've added something new called the NEACL. So the NEACL is basically a presence container that allows you to override your default routing policy. So for example, if you have a policy that says reject all packets coming in from, I don't know, some source, you can have an NEACL that can say accept, or accept only a certain subset of packets that come in. So it's basically a presence container that lets you override any default policies you have on the box. Okay, the inclusion of match and action statements. So this was nothing new. So this was added after we got feedback from Netflix on because they apparently use these matches and actions. So one was adding TCP, UDP, ICMP, and they also needed logging. So this was just a small subset of matches and actions that we've added. There are a lot more that are actually not present in the current native model that we have taken as an open issue. Some of the important items that we have as open issues are, currently the model allows only a single address and a single port to be specified in the address and port fields for source and destination addresses and ports. And this is actually not scalable, and it's not a good design, because you'll have, for one, if you have only a single ACE, you have to have multiple ACEs representing a particular network that you want to accept packets from. So most of the bigger vendors, when I looked at their native models, they support lists. So they will support a list of addresses or a list of ports, and they'll support a operation on each particular list, like a not equal to, or a range. So this is something we are thinking of adding. Another bigger enhancement that we have in the open issues is stats collection. How do we want to collect stats in an ACL model? So for example, you have ingress stats and egress stats. So currently, the draft number 11 doesn't address this issue very well, because you can even have stats that come in that are aggregated over interfaces, stats that are per ACE, per ACL, per interface. Depending on how much resource you have in TCAM, vendors have different stats that are allocated. So stats collection is one big issue. Containers for addresses and ports is another big issue. The remaining issues are basically leaves that we don't have for like ICMP off or precedents, things like that, that we see in various native models. So if we want to get a model that's, that looks good and that's similar to a lot of the native models, then we need to add this into the IETF model and make it competitive with other major models out there. So that was it.
So regarding the open issues, there's going to be technical changes involved to these?
Yes, and actually adding the containers, that needs some thought on how we want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I've already gotten some ideas. I've spoken to various people.
Okay, so this won't be the final version of the...
This can't be the final version.
Okay. Still, how many people have read this version of the draft? It is in last call, so how many people have read this version? A few. Okay, and for those who haven't, again, please try to read it and provide comments. There will be another version coming out.
Yeah, we might at this point send a message to the list saying that, so that we'll probably send a message to the list saying that there is going to be another version, because it doesn't make sense to force folks to read it who would otherwise not read it and then do another last call and try to get them to do it again. So we'll let people know. That doesn't mean don't comment, don't read. It's just that we're not going to have a successful last call at this time, and we'll do another one.
I'm sorry?
Ben was asking, when will the next version be available?
November? Yeah. No, November. Draft 12.
Mahesh Chetanandani. I think we should be able to do a little better than November.
Yeah.
I want to say within the next month or so, we should be at least able to come out with an updated version.
With a full design for all the
And you're speaking as co-author?
Yes.
Just to make sure everyone knows. That's great. Yeah, I mean, if it really was November, I'd be inclined to say, okay, is this one good enough? But so that's good to hear that we'll have something in a month. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Rob Wilson, and I'm going to give you various talks. This first one is an update on what changes we've made to the
just lift your mic up a little.
Is that, well?
Yeah.
Doesn't want to stay. Is that better? Yeah, okay. So, so I want to give an update on the data store architecture draft, what we've changed there. We think it's very close to completion, actually, so we would request people review it. I know there's been some comments on the A-list today. I've not had a chance to read through all those in detail, but thank you for those. So we would like to try and get it finished fairly soon if possible. So a quick reminder what we're talking about. The whole purpose of the NMDA architecture and the problem we're trying to solve is this separation between what an operator is asking a device to do, i.e. their intent, the intended configuration, and what it's actually doing. So the desire here is to very accurately reflect the operational state of the device and to align the namespaces of those as close as possible so that you can easily correlate between both the intent and the actual operational value. As you're probably all aware, we spent quite a lot of sessions discussing and time different solutions to this problem. Have been evaluated by IETF, and we've converged on this as the solution. And the solution defines a new operational state data store. This has implications on the structure of the Yang models, and they end up being simplified for NMDA. And I've got a separate talk on what that looks like and how that affects you. We'll also effectively be updating netconf and restconf as well. to support the operational state data store, and there will be talks in the NetConf working group covering those extensions effectively for those. So we've updated our canonical data stores picture, and the lines in red effectively show you what we've changed. And there's nothing really that's very significant here that's changed. We've tried to align where information is feeding in with the origin metadata. So the origin metadata is a way of annotating where data has come from. So whether values come from your intended configuration, or whether it's coming from the system, or it's coming from a dynamic data store, or you come from a protocol. So we've tidied this up a bit, and we've tidied up the fact that dynamic data stores can feed in here as well. And there could be one of those or multiple of those, and they'd be defined separately. So this is a summary of what's changed, and this is since the -01 version that was presented in Chicago. We also published an 02 in the interim. I feel that what we've done is we've improved the definitions of configuration and state, and we spent a long time on this. We've pulled in, clarified some of the existing definitions of the existing data stores that are defined in the NetConf RFC. So the intent here is this is a canonical definition of them. We've clarified the semantics of the operational state data store in particular, and got some refinements to origin metadata and clarifications on XPath usage that wasn't in there before. So I'll cover each of these 4 areas in more detail. So as we spent a long time trying to come up with good definitions and good terms for what configuration is, what state is, all the different types of configuration are. And we spent many hours discussing this and trying to come up with terms that are both accurate and fairly concise. And it's a very hard task to define what some of these things are. So as part of that, we defined the term conventional configuration data store, which is like the startup and running and candidate that we have today, and intended is also thrown into that category as well, because it sort of logically exists today even if you don't see it. We've added a definition for learned configuration. Now that one is probably worth, again, I'll cover in a bit more detail, is worth thinking about a bit more because some people have some concerns about definition, so we could discuss that today. And we got rid of the term static configuration, which is good because none of the authors liked it. It was a bit of a misnomer because it could change. Yes, as I said before, we've pulled in the definitions of startup, candidate, and running, and our aim here is just to have them all in one place rather than change the meanings of what these data stores are. So we've tried to clarify them, provide extra text to more accurately describe them, but we're not trying to change the meaning of those existing data stores. I ask you, please, if you can, to review these definitions carefully, because once this has been published, then hopefully this will be referenced for quite a while going forward. So getting good reviews on that would be appreciated. So there's been various things discussed on the list. One was the term of what configuration is, and there was a concern about that the definition we were using differs from the one provided in NetConf, I think. So we've now tried to align that to be more closely based on that. And as you can see, the text here, the first sentence is based on the same as the NetConf definition. And what we've actually really clarified here is that in Yang, a configuration node is modeled by something that's config true. And that configuration can come from different sources. The way I sort of like to think of this is that the config true on a node means it can be configured rather than it is going to be configured. So it's something that could be configured through conventional mechanisms is how we're defining it. The other one that's a bit more contentious is the definition of learned configuration, and this has been defined as configuration that's been learned via protocol interactions with other systems that is not conventional or dynamic configuration. So we're trying to find a label for the configuration data that you might get from BGP or from one of your other peer systems in the case where they're overriding a leaf or a node that's in your configuration tree. So an example of this might be a timer value that you could statically configure, or it might also be acquired through a protocol negotiation. And so we're trying to identify, give a name to that sort of configuration that comes into the system, and also to make it explicit that it's not dynamic. So the dynamic configuration is defined as what comes through any dynamic data store. This configuration isn't coming through a dynamic data store, it's just coming elsewhere through the system. And then an open issue that we haven't quite resolved here is whether the learned origin can also apply to state nodes as well. I think that still needs to be discussed. My hunch is the answer will be yes, it can be, that the origin data is only about where data comes from, and so it should apply there, but that's still an open question.
Mehmet Ersu, what is your proposal for the handling of the term configuration in NetConf RFC? Are you proposing to replace it, revise it, delete it?
I don't know, actually. I guess we'd aim to supersede it effectively, that this would...
So we have here a new term definition. We should be interested to decide how we want to handle the old term definition. It can be deleted, I mean, in NetConf BIS RFC, or the same can be used there too, but copy and paste is not good.
Which RFC are you thinking about?
The NetConf protocol RFC.
So I think then it's a good question for the NetConf working group.
Yeah, but I assumed you would have a proposal how to handle it.
So one option is that this document lists as updating that RFC, and we can identify that the sole update is in the name. The other option is that the documents that are headed, the supporting documents that are going on in NetConf could do that. So I would sort of defer to the NetConf chairs on how they would like to do that. So
there needs to be a discussion in NetConf for sure.
Exactly.
It would be probably consistent to remove this term from NetConf BIS RFC and refer to NDMA RFC.
That's a fine solution.
But to be clear...
And then when you do since that BIS will replace the other one, it fixes the document issue. That's perfect. Thank you.
I don't think the semantics here is changing though, so that's worth knowing.
It sounds like the plan proposed presumably as the NetConf co-chair is a good one. Thank you.
And also to add to that, many times in drafts, when they're importing terms from other drafts, they specify which draft they're importing the term from. So, you know, for the term configuration, they could indicate specifically it's the old or the current NetConf RFC or the new revised data store RFC. So it wouldn't be actually ambiguous in the terms of the drafts themselves.
So the second set of changes is a refinement to the definition of the operational data store. And in particular, we wanted to clarify how defaults work in that data store, because our intention is that we don't carry on using with defaults for operational. Our aim here is to try and simplify devices and clients, so that rather than having this mix of different defaults you might support, to try and converge and just have one definition that everyone uses. Because it's a new data store, we're hoping that everyone can work on the same thing. So the idea here is that the defaults in a way don't apply to the operational state data store. The operational data store always gives you the values that are in use by the device. So if a device is using a value, whether it's a default or whether it's come through configuration or some of the mechanism, then it logically exists and is a part of that operational state data store. And hence, nominally, if you query it, you would get that data. Yeah.
David Lamparter. So I've thoroughly hit my head on default values in NetConf schemas, because it's not only the device that needs to be aware that the absence of the value is something different from the default value, but it's also the client libraries and every single thing it passes through in the middle. So I think there's a requirement here to kind of maybe not even have the default in the schema in the best case, because otherwise you're still treating on thin ice.
Yes, so to answer, in the particular case you've got configuration, then a configuration node often has a default value associated with it. And that configuration node exists in the operational state data store as well. So you have it often in the schema, but what I'm saying is in this case you would return that value if it's in use.
Yeah, that might be more updating.
Yes.
Well, Arshangel Eriksson, that's why we have the whole with defaults RFC, because we couldn't agree how to handle defaults. Maybe in operational we can.
Well, I hope so, because it's new. It's a new data store. Nobody's got implementations of this thing. Might be some disagreements.
Andy Bierman, yeah, the reason for suppressing defaults was to improve the transfer efficiency.
Yep.
So if you have a whole bunch of stuff that's in the default value and you're wasting 60% of your packet with stuff that's redundant,
yes,
you don't get that efficiency. So now you're saying we don't care about efficiency, we're going to send all the values all the time?
No, not quite. So in terms of, I've said here, we want to clarify what in use means. I think we want to get a definition of in use that doesn't mean that we throw back a lot of irrelevant data, but we try and find that so it's scoped sensibly that the default values you get back are ones you might be interested in. So not a load of, so if OSPF is turned off, you don't return all the default values for OSPF that aren't of interest. But if OSPF is turned on, then you do return those values. So that's, I think, what we're trying to do is come up with a definition of in use that allows for that.
Well, it seems that explicit mode is clearly not useful because you're talking about read-only data, so it can't be explicitly set to its default value. So only trim really matters, which is if the node's not there, then it must be using the Yang default. And I think that definition is rather clear in Yang 1.1. I don't understand why it needs to change now.
So the other concern that I have is this ambiguity that if you don't return a value, does that mean that the device doesn't know about it, or does that mean the device is using the default value? Now, in an ideal
Yang
world,
says that if it's not there and you're claiming conformance to it, then it is using the default value, no exceptions. So if you're well, I want to get to this later, but I think part of the architecture that's completely lacking is a concept of conformance for data stores. So I'm reading a Yang module. I want to know what is a server that is conforming to this model supposed to do, and you completely failed on providing that information for data stores. Before, we used to know this is candidate running and startup. There were only 3 data stores. There's no way to add new ones like the Acme operational data store, which is now allowed. So really think there has to be something in the Yang module that tells developers what the conformance expectations are, and the defaults could be considered part of that. But the problems that I've been hearing about from customers with operational data is how to make it more efficient. You actually have not fixed GET, because the problem with GET is if I get an entire list, my NMS freezes while I'm getting 10,000 entries. Okay, so we've had to add operations that make it much more responsive to iterate through a list. And of course, you need to iterate through a list without knowing the keys, because operational data, the keys change all the time. So I think you really should focus more on efficiency, because especially with large routers, which you have a lot of, getting lots of operational data it needs to be efficient.
Okay.
David Lamparter again. So unfortunately, this being a completely new data store doesn't help with the defaults either, because it's going to be accessed using the same existing libraries, and that's where the problem really is. So if that library doesn't allow me to even figure out whether the value was specified or is coming from a default, which does exist, there are libraries where I can't tell if I had a default, had a value, or whether I got the default value, then I can't actually access this bit of information.
So I think you're suggesting that it's better to return a value even if it's the same as a default.
I'm saying that if you want to signal this bit of information, whether the value is actually in use, then you need to put that bit of information somewhere that isn't the existence of the value, because the existence of the value is not something that you can reliably test for.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll chat with you afterwards. I'm not sure your question. Yeah.
Balázs Eriksson. And I don't think even the absence of the value doesn't really mean that the default is enforced. Maybe some other protocol removed the default value, and that's why it's not there. Can't we have that situation?
I mean, the case I was thinking of is if one of your daemons has crashed and it's not returning any data, then effectively that doesn't mean that those values are now turned into the default values. There's no data to be returned there. And either you hang the whole response or you've got to compromise. So that's why I think it's sort of nicer from a semantic point of view to always return the value that's in effect. But I do take Andy's point, and that's what we try to find that balance between, is you don't want to then flood the messages with a lot of noise, stuff that you don't care about. So it's trying to find that a reasonable balance if we can.
I think part of the problem is that Yang tries to cover default values both in configuration and operational state, and in fact, in these two cases, the semantics of the default values is quite different. So
yep.
That's why it might be difficult really to come up with some reasonable definition and handling of defaults.
I mean, I think in terms of operational, we regard the default value in the Yang model as being guidance to the reader rather than meaning anything else. So rather than affecting the actual data value that's returned. Okay. So
just a piece of information for you and for the working group. We're now actually taking some of the Q&A time, but that's okay because this is Q&A. So it's okay with us if it's okay with you and the working group.
So how long have I had so far?
You've had 20 minutes.
Fine. Okay, I think that's fine. Okay, so the third of the four sort of major changes we've made, or not major changes, or refinements, is to origin metadata. And here we've refined, and to remind you, the origin metadata is about where the values come from. So the idea here is that you can differentiate that the operational values come from configuration, or it's come from a protocol, or the system has instantiated that value, like a system created interface, for example, or maybe it's been overridden by IETF. So that's the idea here, is you can identify where this data is coming from. And this applies to all the Yang nodes in operational. And currently, we're focusing the thoughts about in the operational state data store, but it's possible that it may apply to other data stores as well. So with intended, there's the thought that we may standardize some templating mechanism. And again, this same sort of idea of annotating where the data has come from might work quite well with that, to say whether a value is directly in the configuration or it's templated expanded, for example. And finally, our intent is that this is optional to implement, because we appreciate that this could be quite expensive. So the new set of origin metadata identities that we expanded. So we've got intended, dynamic, system, learned, default, and unknown. And these match the definitions we've got in the earlier part of the doc. Intended is from the intended data store. Dynamic means it comes from any of the dynamic data stores. And these are identities. So if there's multiple dynamic data stores, if IETF has different levels, for example, then they can be using separate identities underneath dynamic to identify which one of those potentially. The system identity represents effectively configurational state that's coming from the system itself. So your automatically configured protocol, or a loopback zero interface that always exists, for example, would be system. Learned is this one that we discussed earlier that's slightly more contentious about data that's learned from a peer, and this is essentially stuff that isn't dynamic. So it's anything that has come from another system. It's not configuration, it's not dynamic. Default value is a value that comes from the schema. So either an explicit default value in the schema, or where you might have a description statement that describes what that value is. So that's default, and we've got a catch-all unknown. So the systems that can't identify where a particular piece of data that comes from, they can at least actually indicate that. There is still some open questions, I think, in terms of what the best way of encoding this information is, how to optimize for that. I think one of the suggestions at the moment is to mean that when you report a given node, it's the same as the parent, you can omit it, for example, rather than having to report every value for every tree. And then the last one I want to cover is refinement to XPath context. And in essence, I think what we're suggesting here is the fairly intuitive interpretation that if you, the XPath expressions for data that's in operational will resolve to nodes in that data store. They won't resolve to nodes in the configuration data store, for example. XPath expressions that are run in a configuration data store will continue to resolve to the same data store that they're in. And the last interesting one is that we're saying that input-output parameters for notifications, RPCs, and action statements, again, they're evaluated in the context of operational. So that doesn't mean that those operations necessarily have to just apply to operation. They don't. But we're saying that when parameters are evaluated, that's the scope that they'll be evaluated in. And the alternative to that is, if you don't like that, would be to have data store specific semantics for those operations to identify they apply to different particular data stores. Okay. So open issues. There's been, as I said, there's been a few more on the A list to discuss about learned, effectively, origin and meaning of learned data. I think this conversation about defining in use needs some refinement in terms of what that means, and also how to optimize the data we return so we don't return too much noise. There's been a question about guidelines. Should they be in the body? This is for the guidelines for writing new data store. Should that be normative text or not? I think it was in the body before, Benoit. We moved it to the appendix. So I think it's meant to just be text rather than a normative statement. Sue?
Could you go back a couple slides? There's one thing I didn't find, because I found all the XPath. So, excuse me. Thank you very much. Name is Sue Harris. I'm interested in, except for the derived identities, I didn't find that when I walked through the text this morning. Dynamic data stores except for derived identities. Can you explain that? Maybe I just don't understand what you meant when you were running through that.
No, because I'm not sure I do understand either. So I think there might be a typo. Effectively what it's meaning here is the dynamic identity itself is probably more likely to be abstract, and that rather than returning that, if you're a dynamic data store, you derive from that and you return the derived value.
Okay, in your Yang model that's generic, I found the dynamic identity, good stuff. It's a generally defined identity. It's not specific to a dynamic data store. It's just specific to those identities. So
the dynamic identity that's in that file is generic.
Yes.
If you had a dynamic data store, you would augment those identities or derive from them, derive from those identities. Have as your base, and you'd end up with those being in a different Yang module associated with your new data store.
I mean, that's good. I just didn't find, you asked me to read the draft carefully, and I'm reading it obviously with the R2S background with dynamic in mind, and I never found that second sentence or the exception. It is carefully laid out in the appendix, for ephemeral data stores was very helpful and very useful. And the XPath, I think if I understood it, also is generic and can work with dynamic data stores as well as.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So I didn't find any problems. Nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Lampotter. This is actually a good solution for the earlier default problem to make it similar to this, I think, because if you move away from whether the value is present and actually make it an explicit metadata on the item, then you can just have the bit there whether the value is in use and the system is actually using it, and then you're done.
So, and then you're saying that if no value is returned, it by definition means it's not in use.
Right. It doesn't matter whether you return a value. The question whether it's in use is going to be answered by the metadata. So obviously you should return a value if you're using it, because that wouldn't make sense otherwise. But if you're not using the value, it doesn't matter if you return one, but you should put in the metadata whether it's not in use.
Okay, possible.
So Tim Kirinoki, I think the problem with that is, I think one of the reasons for the default value as stated by Andy was that you were trying to save space.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm sending metadata back, might as well send the value back, right?
I just want to clarify that wasn't actually the purpose. The purpose of the way we allowed flexibility in handle defaults was for configuration, because we had implementations that handle it very, very differently. Under iOS, if you set a configuration variable to the default value, it disappears from the configuration. Sorry, Phil Schaefer, Junos. Juniper Networks. Under Junos, my baby, if you put it there, if you put a default value, if you hand configure default value, it remains because we think you knew what you were doing. So there you have two very different models of how to handle default values, and that was actually the reason the space savings was less of an issue.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. Actually, we had 3 different methods of handling defaults because the other method is that if you have a default, it gets there and you don't care any longer how it got there. So we have 3 different handling, and I think if we have with defaults on get data, that would solve this capacity issue. So why not handle it that way?
Phil Schaefer again. The issue with that is that the operational data store is to show you what the box is actually using, and so if there's a value in use, you want to see that. You can decorate it with origin default to know where it came from, but you really care that it's there. In the same way, if it's not in use, you don't want to see it, regardless of whether it's the default value or not. If there's if I have an interface and there's a default MTU, and the interface isn't there, I don't care about the default MTU. If the interface is down, I don't care about the default MTU. It's not in use. So that's really the value of having the operational data store give actual in-use values, and I think that's really key.
I have another question that I already asked before, but it doesn't seem to have been resolved, and it's about templates. The draft still mentions templates several times, very lightly, but I understand that validation is to be done on the intended data store, but Yang also requires some constraints to be satisfied on all data trees, and I don't know if the idea is that unexpanded templates or the data tree with unexpanded templates, which is supposed to be in running probably, whether it's really necessary that all these constraints are also satisfied, and if so, I think it should be mentioned in the draft that only this kind of templates is under consideration or something.
Maybe.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. I think this comes back to what Andy says, that if you are not forced, for example, to implement intended or some of these data stores, and if you choose a specific combination of data stores that you are actually implementing, for each of these combinations, what is compliance needs? Well, which parts are validated? How the flow of information goes through. For example, for us, a related question is that if have a model config true and config false mixed up, we don't show the operational versus running differences. So in that sense, we don't implement the operational as a separate, but still we will implement the config false in operational. Now, do we implement this model or not?
So I think that to answer that question, whereas before you're comparing like running with config false, you're actually you return that as in a single get operation. You're returning the intent, the configuration the operator is asking for, that a device is allowed to do nothing with, and the operational state of what it's actually doing at that point in time. So if you had a system running a large amount of configuration and a large config change came in your running, you'd see the new configuration, and all the operational leaves, the config false leaves, are actually related to what it's currently doing. And those nodes that need to exist for it to be able to return the data might not even be there in the new configuration. So you're sort of stuck with the existing model. Whereas with this one, the operational state data store, it's obvious. The configuration is the applied configuration. It's what's there and running in the system. So the structure always logically exists.
I like your model, so I like what you have done, but you have to describe what it means if I'm implementing part of it only, because it will take time.
Okay, so the other question was about intended, for example. The intended data store just degenerates back to running if you don't have template support or you don't do comment out config. So whether you allow people to do a get operation on that or not, it should be relatively simple to code because you just point to the same data as in running. I take the question about in terms of Lara's question about validation of templates. I think that needs more consideration as to exactly how we address that. Chris?
Christian Hops, Deutsche Telekom. So Phil, you just said something that confused me, or maybe confused me. And maybe so if the interface state is down, do I lose a lot of my operational? Like I'm thinking if I change it, because we change our MTU, right? We make it like 9,000. Is that something I'm going to run into where I'm only going to see it intended if the interface is down?
No, sorry, that was a comment on operational. It's always in intended. Intended is your intended configuration. In operational, you'll see what's in use. If it's not being used, you shouldn't see it.
So to clarify, I think it depends on the implementation. So one implementation may say, yes, the interface exists, it has an MTU programmed, it's down. Another implementation may say, well, no, it's not in that part of the system, hence I don't return it.
Or more in a square box. The problem is we don't have a definition for in use, which was one on the previous slides.
Yeah, okay. So that's what I'm saying, because is MTU...
Lean into the mic, please.
Oh.
Is MTU, a value that's active even though the interface is down? Okay, so that's confusing.
And that's not a clear statement. It's not clear right now because we don't have a fixed definition for in use.
Rob, 20 minutes.
Okay.
For the whole.
Rick Taylor, I'll try and keep this quick. I've become confused about the difference between dynamic and learned. I'm really sorry. I can't think of anything that has an origin of learned that isn't basically just dynamic. It may only get set once right at the beginning. Your protocol may negotiate some value, overriding your config intended value gets overridden by the negotiation. Surely that's just dynamic, but it only gets updated once.
So this identity really means dynamic data store. So maybe the name of that identity should be dynamic data store or one of those dynamic data stores.
So what's learned then?
Learned is coming from a protocol that's not one of the configuration protocols and not through a dynamic data store. So something that like your BGP peers or your VRP peers and things, when they return values that override your configuration, that was what would be marked as learned values.
Yeah, I do understand that, but it just seems like that's another not particularly often changing dynamic data store. You could express your... perhaps I'm drifting into I2RS and Susan will tell me off now.
Okay. NTP...
So the idea is that a dynamic data store is something inside this ecosystem that we're building, and learned is somebody else. It's that sort of division.
So learned is actually external. Something outside of your whole config model has set this value.
Outside the box.
Outside the ecosystem we're defining. So DHCP, DHCP, you could conceivably make a DHCP daemon that takes data and puts it into a dynamic data store, and it comes in that way. But you probably won't because you're going to use the ISC. So if your DHCP data comes in through a dynamic data store, it should be tagged as dynamic because it's under this whole ecosystem and it understands the rules and everything. If it comes in from a traditional DHCP implementation, it will come in as learned because we want to say, here's data we got. Somewhere. Okay.
By the way, that was Phil Schaefer and Rick Taylor at the mic, going too fast to say their names constantly.
This is Christian Hops again. So I do have a suggestion on how I would like to see that resolved. The interface down state thing. It came up earlier in routing working group about failures being failures that happen later on after the system has said, okay, I've taken that value, right? And it replied back, everything went okay with that config value. That later on I would have to detect a failure by looking into operational state to see if it changed, right? And that would be one way of detecting a failure. Another way might be a notification, which was the case in Routing Working Group. So as a suggestion for how to determine whether something is in use, like an MTU, if it's not a failable condition, I'd kind of expect it to be applied, right? So in other words, even if my interface is down, if I change the MTU to 9,000, and there's just no case where that's never not going to work when the interface comes up, then I want to see, I think, change and applied, right? Because there's no reason for it not to.
Yes, I think that's probably a definition we'll end up.
You know, as long as the system is saying, okay, it has taken the 9,000 value, and as soon as the interface comes up, it's going to have an MTU of 9,000, then I want to see it applied.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Jason Stern, I just had a question back for you. How about then the case if that line card is physically unplugged from the router? Do you still expect to see your MTU for that interface?
No, then it'd be removed from applied configuration.
Okay.
That's in the draft.
So if you're up or down, you'd still see it, but if the thing is unplugged and you couldn't possibly apply it, it's gone from applied.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you mean administratively up or operationally up, Chris Hobbs?
Well, yeah, I mean, my particular case I'm thinking of is that I'm going to, keep interface. There's a lot of different vendors and stuff. I'm going to take an interface down and change some values and bring it back up.
Right, but not if the fiber is unplugged. You want it to see.
I think it's still down. I still want the MTU to be there.
All right. Before we leave this draft, I know we are cutting into other time. Now that we have open issues and maybe heard a couple more here, what do you think is your timeline for resolving all open issues?
I don't know. The other authors might like to comment as well. I think the draft's quite close. I think there are some things of these discussions we need to go through and revise those, but I still think it'd be good to get comments from everyone.
So our thought was to aim for last call in September.
Yeah, I think that's
and we have August with vacations and July too. Do you think that's still an attainable goal?
I think I'd have to decide other authors if they think that's agreeable.
I'm not sure what that means.
My sock puppet's nodding.
Jürgen Katz, yeah.
Okay, so hearing otherwise, I'm going to say as chair, we'd like you to continue to aim to the goal of resolving all your issues by September so that we can do a last call not by September, in September, so that we can do the last call then and be ready to send over to the ISG in October.
Phil Schaefer, I think it's important that we keep that deadline because being lazy humans, we will not make it if there's not a deadline. So I'm all for keeping a rigorous deadline.
Thank you. Do you want to move on to the next one?
Yes.
Target, not deadline.
So the second presentation is guidelines affecting how do you migrate to the NMDA architecture. This is the same presentation I gave in Routing Working Group earlier today, so you've seen that, so you can tune out for that. Problem definition, I'll skip over. That's the same as I've just presented. Today, in terms of what YANG models look like in various drafts and different bodies, there's really three fundamental categories they fit into. We've got the IETF split config state top-level style, and that's like the interfaces versus interfaces state. RFC 7223 has that style, and the interfaces, the config tree has all your configuration. The state tree has may have the configuration replicated again. It may be slightly different. It may also have the other config false leaves as well. So in this particular case, ideally the two would marry up, but they don't necessarily do that. The second style of model structure we come across is the open config style that they've been pushing forward. And there they have explicitly config and state containers directly above wherever the configuration leaves are. So as soon as you have some configuration leaves in one of those models, you create a config container, and then you create a peer state container under the same parent, and you put both the config nodes there and the state nodes there as well. That uses a single tree structure. And then the third one that obviously I'm going to talk about here is the combined structure as well. So the NMDA style is a single tree, but without any replication. So as an example to try and illustrate this, I'm using a subset of the BGP model. I've got 4 global leaves. I'm considering 2 in blue, our configuration, the AS number, the router ID, and 2 are state leaves, the total paths and total prefixes. And I've got 4 neighbor leaves as well. I'm trying to put that in to illustrate what a list might look like in these 2 trees. 2 of those leaves are configurable, and 2 of those are in a container and state nodes. So what does that look like? So I'll start with the IETF split config and state tree. That's what this subset of BGP would look like. On the left-hand side, you've got, in blue, you've got the configuration tree named BGP with all the configuration. On the right-hand side, you've got the state tree named BGP-state. And in this case, I've copied all the configuration leaves across to that configuration nodes. And then in the shaded orange boxes, you've got the config false nodes from the schema. So although the whole of the BGP state tree is config false, the ones that are light are the ones that are copied from configuration, and the ones that are shaded are those real sort of derived state or operational state. And in terms of how you produce this model, generally you either have to replicate that structure by hand, or you have to use groupings to get the same structure between the BGP side, the configuration side, and the state side. And in my experience, the models I've looked at, you find that sometimes these state trees start to deviate from the configuration trees. They're not an exact one-to-one representation. So you can't always know exactly where a state leaf is going to exist. And what we want you to move to is this. So effectively, you've taken those config false state leaves, i.e. the ones that aren't a duplication of the configuration, and you've merged them into the appropriate place in the configuration tree. So you can see like total paths and total prefixes have just moved into the same place in the configuration tree under the same parent it would be, and likewise with the ones lower down. So this has the advantage that the structure is guaranteed to be right, because you've only got one structure in the model. There's no separation to go wrong. And it has the other advantages that the NDR model that you produce is generally far shorter than the other examples, either the split config state tree or the OC model. Yes,
Ladel Hutka. So here in this example, one interesting case is this router ID, because if I remember correctly, in the routing data model, there is a feature that makes this router ID available at the global level or something like that. But of course, if this feature is off, it doesn't mean that the router that doesn't have any ID. It only means that there is some algorithm that the ID becomes assigned automatically somehow. So it means that basically in this case, or some routers will have both router ID and configuration and in state data, but some routers will have it only in state data. But if we keep this if feature, for example, on this router ID, we need to distinguish somehow that this, if you want to have just one data node for both configuration and state data, it means we have to somehow distinguish that this feature does not hold for the state data version. So things like this will come up very often. So I'm not really a big friend of this join tree, but yeah.
So a feature, yes, that's something that if you had a difference between the config and state, then clearly you would.
It's other things. It's the default value, for example, and so on, right?
But we're saying, so effectively in this case, we're saying that having it in blue and saying it's config true doesn't mean it has to be configured, only that it's configurable. And we're saying that if you configure a value and you end up using a different value, then in the operational tree, you'll see that different value, and you'll see the origin that says it's a different value coming from the system. Whereas if it's come from configuration, you'll see that it's marked with the same value and it's come from the intended configuration. So I think, other than the if feature comment you've made, I think you can still get away with one node here, and that's the desire, that you look at it on the same path. And you can then resolve whether it's your configuration taking effect, or if not, you can go and look as to why the determinants. Yeah. So.
Clarification question on that last answer. The reason the router ID is there is because sometimes people configure on the BGP peer another router ID. Why they do that, that's a different subject. So there is the initial one that Lada was pointing to very nicely, and then there may be a different one. My understanding those are two facts. My question and clarification, because this can be set, I believe it operates in the way that is expected in the BGP configuration, whether that it's unique variable, how it's populated. Can it be populated from the base, or what are you saying? Are you and Lotta saying something that has to be there from the data store, or is that just general logic you're trying to provide?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question. You're
So-
saying there's
so
a value
on a-
lower down the tree as well?
Pardon?
You're saying there's a value for your peer for the router ID?
Some people want to play with the router ID that they announced to the peer.
Oh, fine.
Long
okay.
story.
So-
So they want to actually configure it. That's why sometimes it's there.
Okay. So to answer your question then, this is one of the cases I think that Phil described as sort of a complex default. So in the description statement of the data model, under the router ID that's for the peer, you would say, if there's no value configured here, you would pick up the value that is assigned to the global router ID effectively.
Okay, and is that's the text, or is that the default text that you were
That would be in the description text, because
Okay.
I don't think, and the draft makes it quite clear that that's still a default. That's still origin default that would be reported there. It's just that it's too complicated to put in a single statement.
Okay, so if it came from the origin, from the base, you would have an origin, and the other one you'd have configured?
It would be origin default if it came from the base, otherwise it'd be origin configured.
Okay.
Intended.
That's very precise, thank you.
Okay.
3 minutes.
Okay, fine. So the other example I'll show you very quickly is what the open config model looks like. So that's again, it's the same leaves here. And as I was mentioning before, under or above each configuration leaf, like the AS and the router ID, you end up putting in a config container. And then as a peer to that config container, you create a state container as well at each level. And then you put the state leaves underneath that state container. And to copy both of the configuration leaves and also the ones that are traditionally config false today, your derived state or additional state. With this structure, there are some limitations because it's sharing a config tree. There's only one tree. So in elements that are created on the system, like a system-created interface, you have to sort of bend the rules of Yang to make that allowed, because you can't actually, it's not configured, but it exists in a config tree in terms of a get operation, for example. So advantages of NMDA, I don't know if it's worth skipping through the rest of this slide deck. I'll probably list.
Yeah, I think this group is convinced of NMDA.
Yeah. So how to migrate? Obviously, we're saying everyone should migrate their models to this NMDA architecture. All the ones that are currently published will be revised, or all the ones that need to be will be revised to NMDA. And in essence, what you're doing, as I said before, is you're copying the config false leaves in the state tree into the config tree, and then you remove the foo state tree if it's an unpublished draft, or you mark it as deprecated, it exists. And then you need to check the descriptions for some of these cases where a value, the configured value, and the description refers to a configured value, and it needs to be massaged a little bit to be applying both to config and state. And then the other thing I just want to cover is, well, can these modules be used on existing NetConf RESTconf servers? And the answer is yes, but there's two conditions where there's a problem. One is where there's no way of reporting the applied configuration value. So if you had some protocol configuration, like the MTU one that Chris mentioned earlier, there's no way of reporting that that MTU value is not in effect. But for many cases, like the MTU example, it doesn't actually matter. What you put in is normally trivially applied over some period of time. So this isn't necessarily a breaking thing for people today. And the other case which you can't handle is these system-created objects. So with this new combined tree of interface and interfaces, states, for example, you'd not be able to represent an interface, a system-created interface. Obviously, when you have the NMDA that comes along, that's fine. So we don't think this is a problem for most modules, but for the case that there is a problem, then you can easily mitigate this by creating a separate config false version, foo state version of that module. So you just take the same module file, you shove -state at the end, you mark it all config false, and you reuse the type defs to save having new types. And then that's a way to something you can use until such time as an NMDA implementation is available. But I'd like to stress that we only expect that to be used when necessary, put in an appendix, avoid it if you can, and it will be deprecated over time. Yes.
Sorry, Igor Briskin, Huawei. So I have the situation when, when we migrate from, basically I don't know how to handle without an NMDA situation like make before break. Say I configured something and it succeeded, so I can see it as a applied configuration, right? Then I tried to modify it, and this new configuration failed. Okay, so with the NMDA architecture, I can see intended configuration by late configuration and applied configuration, which is currently in place, right? So if I'm not using MDA, right, architecture, so I don't know how can I see this delta, what is actually configured versus what was intended to configure and has failed.
So the answer is you can't. That's point one that's effectively mentioned there, unless you create this duplicate separate tree. But in many cases, you said there, you can tell that when you got the response back from netconf, you know the configuration is applied. But you don't actually know that. All you know is the system's accepted the configuration. It will act on it at some point in the future. It's not guaranteed. So there's lots of ambiguity as to what the actual semantics of netconf operations say today. People interpret them as meaning the configuration is applied, and some operators or some devices act that way, others don't. So there's no consistency there, whereas what we're proposing here will be consistent.
Right. So the problem is that when I try to do this make before break, I don't know immediately that it will fail. I learn about this in some time. Okay, so the server actually accepted this configuration, but during signaling, for example, the problem was detected. Okay,
but that's no different from today. Yeah. An existing device today could behave that same way. It's up to the implementation to decide whether they delay replying until they check that it can be applied or reply immediately. It doesn't specify in the existing specifications.
This was the same issue that came up earlier in the routing working group, so we should come up with a good answer, whether it's to take the approach being taken there, which is to add specific notifications, or something more generic.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, also, we have a question on Meet Echo, so go ahead.
And actually, we're going to need to cut the line because after the Meet Echo, sorry, because we're really over, and we're going to steal some time for the next one. So this question, and then okay, we've seemed to have lost Eric.
Yeah, he was in.
So if he shows back up, we'll give him that. In the interim, I actually want to ask a question as chair. The key from all this is not only us getting in sync, which is hugely important, it's also getting agreement on the language that goes into 6087 BIS.
Yep.
I have an understanding of what the plan is. Should I relay it, or can you tell us what the plan is among the authors? How we get there?
Well, I think we need to have some definitive text just saying these, with instructions saying this is how you model it.
So my understanding is that the authors are going to propose some text on the list that for what will go into 6087 BIS.
Yeah,
is that
I think
right?
so. Yes.
Do you have a timeline for that?
Well, Kent proposed it.
So.
Well, if none of my co-authors do it, I'll do it in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great, because we want to get to some agreement. Obviously, without text, we don't know if we agree.
Yeah.
So once we have the text, we can discuss it on the list, and hopefully, in very short order, have an agreement on what the recommendations are, and then be able to resubmit 6087 BIS.
Yeah.
Okay. Andy Bierman, I wasn't going to go to the mic, but you started to talk about this. Maybe I can talk with Kent this week about the text. But what are the guidelines for someone who's going to say, well, I want the keys for this list to be different in operational state than they are in config. I have one more key to add. Or they say the operational state value leaf is a different value set. Are we discouraging people from that and forcing them to use the same keys everywhere, and not expose a key that they wanted to put in there? Or so what's the guidelines for when the model is not this simple?
Okay, I agree. We'll provide guidance on that.
Yeah, so there was a slide deck with some Q&A in it that's good to look at. Also, there was a couple of questions that came in through Jabber that didn't get it to the mic because we were cut. I will copy in the Jabber questions into the Etherpad so they become part of the record. And actually, Jabber is always available as part of the record either way. And sorry for not getting to the Jabber people.
Okay, so I'm William Lupton, representing Broadband Forum. I'm the Broadband Forum software architect. I've got 10 minutes, and so I just want to give a quick update on Broadband Forum and what we're doing with Yang and sort of what principles we're applying. So I want to cover all this very briefly. You know, what do we regard as being in and out of scope? What are we currently working on, and what have we published? How do we publish? What about draft Yang? Because obviously we're a member organization, so our work is not all publicly visible. What about the Yang catalog? And then finally, a little bit on sort of best practices and, well, dependencies on external Yang and best practices. So our emphasis is on addressing our own requirements rather than on general solutions. I mean, we don't actively avoid general solutions, but that's what's driving us, which I think is, you know, a contrast for sort of core SDOs such as IETF, where I think the emphasis is more on providing something generally useful. And our current emphasis is on what we would call broadband access nodes, so the equipment sort of between the home and the internet. For example, those are two of our main standards that are providing the requirements that are driving our current work. And so we'll define in BBF Yang where it's for things that we've defined, or Yang where it's for things other people have defined, but the organization is not interested in defining it. So for example, some of the first Yang we did was for some ITU physical layer standards. And we will reuse Yang from other organizations whenever it's possible. So these are our current projects, sort of showing the areas on the left, then sort of internal project names, just quick description. And then you can see that the top right are the ones we've actually published, which I've got a little bit more information on in the upcoming slides. And then you can also see in bold, there's one project for which we published draft Yang, and I'll also talk a little bit more about draft Yang. So, I seem to have...
Could people pass up the blue sheets while he's...
Okay, this slide has actually lost a picture, but...
I think if you... Oh,
no, that's the next one.
It did give me an error message about...
Okay, well, okay, it's lost a picture. It was a beautiful picture. But I was never going to go through the picture in detail anyway. So these were the first ones we published back a year ago. So these were the ones I just mentioned, actually, the ITUT physical layer standards for VDSL2, G.fast, and also some sort of associated, sort of like, for example, a handshake protocol. Well, I've got more on dependencies on IETF, but there the main dependencies was on the interfaces model. And we're now working on some new features, and I've given you some examples there, bonding and reverse power feed. Then there would have been a picture that just showed the modules and their dependencies. Lots and lots of submodules here, actually. These are quite complex standards, but only a small number of modules. Oh, sorry. What have
no, it's the screen.
I pressed the button too far below. This is the other one, which are what we call the common Yang modules for access networks. These have also been published. So the idea is that these are applicable. So it's a little bit analogous with NetMod, I think. These are modules that we expect to be widely applicable. And so similar dependencies, but also IETF system and IETF hardware. There it's a draft. Obviously, we're aware that we're going to have to think about how to apply the data stores here. So thank you for that. We're also working on some new features there, and I've listed some there. And note alarm management, that's another dependency there. I don't expect you to be able to read what's on that picture there, but it's just showing you, those are all modules as opposed to submodules, and it's showing import dependencies, and it's also showing areas, and it's also showing external organizations there via the various containing boxes and colors. So how do we publish it? We have a software release registry, which is a grand name for just a wiki page that lists everything we've published, including both draft and standard Yang. It all goes into this Broadband Forum area Yang repository in GitHub with separate areas for draft and standard. And then it's also all available via the sort of de facto standard Yang models Yang repository via a submodule, which just points to the above BBF-owned module. There's some examples in the background slides. Draft Yang, for some projects, in fact only really one, sorry, we've made draft Yang available for study purposes. It does have a different license, and that's in that area of the GitHub. But we are currently working on making sure that such draft Yang is available across the board for all projects and will be updated reasonably frequently. I mean, we wouldn't expect every commit to be visible. We would still expect there to be some sort of decision to make it available, but we want a very low bar on making that decision. And also, just as a plug, really, all the draft and standard Yang is available in the Yang catalog. So I'm going to flip through these at the rate of about 1 every 2 seconds. So you could go into the catalog and you could do that's a cunningly constructed regular expression search that only matches one thing. And then you would get this, and then you could click on the impact analysis, and you would get this, from which you can see that there's a draft BBF module, which is it green? I'm not sure, I'm colorblind, which is dependent both on some published BBF Yang and on some published IETF Yang. And you can see there are even links to the corresponding documents, which is all quite nice, and that's all enabled by the metadata. So, okay, just to put it all into one place, back to external Yang. So we do have a policy that our modules must use external, particularly IANA and IETF Yang modules whenever possible. I already sort of said that. But this is intended to be letter adherence to the letter and the spirit. We really do want to be using these modules as they were intended to be used. Just to put it all together, those are the ones we're currently dependent on directly. And then I also mentioned this already, but the stuff we're working on at the moment also very much we intend to depend on the IETF alarms. I mean, this is actually a very active area at the moment that we're working on internally. And then just finally, we also have our own sort of version of our own sort of Yang best practices, which is based on and adheres to 687 BIS as much as possible. I mean, in the future, it could also equally refer to other SDOs, but right now it's IETF. So it's a mixture of qualification to and extensions of guidelines that are in 687 BIS, but also there are some additional BBF-specific guidelines. We do plan to share that with you guys. We just haven't got around to deciding how best to do that yet. And also there are some more detailed examples of guidelines in both those two categories in the background slides. And that's it. Thank you. Have I gone too fast now?
No. A little bit. Now we're left with 2 extra minutes. But wait, we have an AD coming to the mic.
So Benoit speaking. So thanks for this. So you heard about NMDA, right? So I guess that tomorrow we'll get the NMDA question and answer by Rob, where he's going to show the different RFCs.
No, we actually did that today. We used it. Rather than do it as a formal Q&A session, we took it just during discussion time. So we used all our Q&A time this session.
Right, but there are a list of RFCs that will need to be updated, right?
I'll bring that up right now.
Okay, maybe it's for tomorrow. My point.
No, it's not for tomorrow.
It's Wednesday.
Okay. Now the question is, you know about an NMDA, right? So it's a difficult question, but do you have any plans there?
Well, right now, no, there is no. This is not something we have raised in BBF yet,
right?
But we must. And I think, I mean, off the top of my head, our plans will go along the same lines as. I mean, I think the guidance that Rob presented, I would think we would apply that guidance to our modules, just in the same way that you're asking other IETF working groups to do that. The particular implications for us will be the 2 IETF modules that we're dependent on that have this split, which would be the interfaces module and the hardware module. And we're just going to have to deal with it. And I presume we will do it in the same way, that we will, I mean, I know there's some discussion of exactly what deprecated means at the moment, but we will, I presume, I'm not sure which should be the core one. The state one, I think, is the proposal. So we would, I guess, is that right? We would deprecate the config and bring the config into the core, or the other way around. Okay, we'd do it the way around we're requested to do it, and just take the hit on how we decide to publish that and so on. I mean, I don't see that we have any option. We won't ignore it.
All right, perfect. And one last thing I want to mention, in the catalog we're going to have very soon, I guess a week or 2, the metadata on what is the 3 type that we have. Is this like an MDA, OpenConfig?
Okay.
So it will help to see.
Okay, yeah. So happily we'll support some additional metadata to go into the catalog. Yeah.
Yeah. Back to the Q&A. We actually, while we used most of that time, or all that time this time. We have a talk that was supposed to be given that Alex isn't going to be able to give tomorrow. No, you said you are going to give it. Never mind. I was going to steal your time. Oh, well. Good thing you're sitting here now. Protected it. All right. We have 10 seconds left.
All right. So we're not going to change conformance things like stuff like NetConf state that was published as just monitoring. Now we're going to be configuring things. So why would we move something that's purely monitoring into make that a configuration module? I don't understand. So I guess this slide needs a lot more discussion.
This was for discussion. This was things that need to be looked at. So Rob had went and identified some RFCs that bear some investigation. This isn't our list as chair saying we are absolutely doing this. This was input for discussion. The slides are there. They were intended to get discussion going. Let's get the discussion going on the list. All right, with that, we're done. Thank you very much, and we will see you at the next session, which is Wednesday at 1:30, right back here.